So what I wanted just to do, really, Laura first, is just set the scene for us. The opinion polls are quite close.
They're very close, and they're actually getting closer in terms of those who are likely to vote for the UK to remain in and those who are likely to vote for the UK to leave the EU. And interestingly, there's been a lot of noise around the differences between the nations within the UK, but actually those figures are closer than one would believe as well. So we're seeing sort of 35% in favour in England of leaving, 33% odd in Wales, and around 28% in Scotland. So there's a lot of noise around national differentiations, but in truth there's a similar narrative emerging across the UK now.
For those wanting to leave, for those wanting to stay, there's more people in Scotland who want to stay than there's in England or Wales. Is that right?
There is, yeah. There's a slightly stronger support for retention of EU membership in Scotland, but that issue has been played very strongly by the SNP, as one would expect. It's less huge a gap than some would lead you to believe, but nevertheless there is greater support there. There's also a lack of real knowledge in Wales, as the opinion polls show, over what the EU actually does and what Wales has benefited in terms of finance and other sources from the EU.
Because, Gareth, that could be quite surprising. We've told ourselves a long time in Wales that Wales is a more pro-European country than the rest of the UK, than England in particular. But as Laura said, well, that's true in Scotland. It's less true in Wales, much more similar to England. What do you put that down to?
I think it's easy to put it down to where people get their information. And most Welsh people get their information from newspapers and the media that are based in London. You know, there's not many people that read Welsh newspapers, apart from those that read Golwg, of course, who I work for at the moment. You know, and that is the problem. You know, and it was always thus. Although the vote last time in overall was about 67% of the people that voted yes last time, in Wales it was 64 or something like that that voted yes, and 37 against last time. So very different. So since people were enthusiastic about Europe, something's happened. They moved back from that enthusiasm. And maybe the referendum campaign might inject some of that enthusiasm back into it, but it's not there yet.
Do you buy that, Laura? Do you think it's the media between England and Scotland and Wales that accounts for that difference?
I don't think it accounts for it. It's a feature in it. I think one has to look at the support for UKIP as well, which clearly is very different in Wales to Scotland. UKIP saw one of its biggest increases in votes anywhere in the UK in Wales in the general election last year, and of course, as we know, knocked Plaid Cymru into 4th place, and that came after a really tremendous result for UKIP in the European elections the year before. So, you know, Wales is different in terms of support for the single party that has leaving the EU as its raison d'etre, and I think that's hugely significant.
And is one of the challenges for the people who are going to be running the campaign to stay in Europe that the messages are very different depending on where you sit on the political spectrum, whereas the no's are quite coalesced around the case for leaving. The case, for example, you mentioned Plaid Cymru, would be quite a different case from maybe a pro-Cameron Conservative. Well,
I think it's inevitable that the case will operate on various different levels because, you know, a purely economic argument for staying in the EU is probably not enough. It can't just be a transactional argument that we get more out of the EU as a small country, or indeed the UK gets more out of the UK than we do out to the EU than we do actually contribute. I think it has to be on the issue of relationships, on identity, on cultural alignment, and the future of the next generations and so on. So I think it's inevitable that there will be a multi-layered approach to the arguments for and against.
There's not, excuse the background noise, BBC Wales Today doing a live. But what Laura said there is important, Gareth, because that's not really been a feature of the campaign to stay in so far. The argument has been quite similar to the Scottish referendum. We've been around frightening people about the consequences of losing jobs, rather than an emotional case.
Yes, I think has been about bread and butter issues, and I don't think that inspires most people. And I think there's another element which we haven't mentioned in here, but there is a fantastically large group of people out there that say a curse on all politicians, and if the establishment are saying stay in, then a large number of those people will say, well, let's vote out. And that is something that they've got to counteract if you're campaigning to stay in. The other thing which I think will be of interest is the more successful David Cameron is in winning back the things that he wants and his party want, it creates a bigger dilemma for those people on the left of politics in the United Kingdom. They'll say, well, if they're pulling back from all those things, all those things that Jacques Delors won for, Jacques Delors came to the TUC and basically won over the Labour movement in the United Kingdom. Well, the more successful Cameron is actually his agenda, then the more doubt there will be in the minds of lots of people on the left of the political spectrum in this country about whether they should be voting yes.
I see we have in the audience Howell Carey-Jones, who was Jacques Delors' chief advisor. It was important creating that case for saying Europe should not just be about the economy. But that is the feature of the current debate, isn't it? The UK government is making it about the economy and not what used to be called the social Europe.
Yes, although if you look at the so-called baskets that Cameron has been arguing around within the negotiations, one of them is around governance and the primacy of the UK Parliament when it comes to critical legislative decision-making. So I think there's been an attempt to move it on to some of the more legislative and social ground, but clearly the economy will be the driving factor. And for me, I think when we get closer to the actual vote, whenever that may be, it'll be the question of risk in people's mind. What's the greatest risk? Is the greatest risk actually leaving? It's always harder to vote for change than it is to vote for the status quo, as we know, and Scotland saw a little bit of that last year. So I think that the economic risk and the jeopardy to jobs and so on will undoubtedly dominate the campaign, but there are other issues.
So it's all about the don't knows. There will be lots of people watching tonight, both here in the hall, live online, and tomorrow night on television. What do the two protagonists have to do to win their argument tonight, Gareth?
Well, I think the argument for the no side is reasonably straightforward because they don't have to worry too much. They can appeal to that populist instinct out there that says a curse on all politicians. And I guess that's what we'll see tonight. Carwyn-Jones, I think, has a more difficult task because he is a Prime Minister. He does lead a country. So he has to be guarded in what he says. But he has to somehow inspire his audience. And that's what you'll be measuring. So there'll be dog whistle noises from one who'll be saying, a curse, and it's all going to go gloom and this and that, and you can do, you've not succeeded, Europe hasn't succeeded for you, and there's an awful lot of people that think that. And Carwyn has to make that convincing argument. He says, that Wales is better off because it is in part of Europe, and that's what the task he sets himself tonight.
Okay, Gareth, thank you very much. Laura, what do you think they need to do?
Well, I think the First Minister particularly will need to inject an emotional dimension to the campaign. Rather than bombard people just with bald statistics, there needs to be some kind of vision of what, actually, interestingly, what Wales and the UK would look like outside the EU. Because clearly that's the ace card, I think, for those who want to stay in, that the picture of our national future will be much weaker if we were to leave the EU. So it'll be interesting to see what the FM says on that score. And then I guess for Nigel Farage, it'll be the extent to which he is able to convince people that he's not just another politician arguing in the same way as every other politician does, and that he's offering something different and something that's credible and could work for the UK.
Okay, Laura, thank you very much.